Bismillahi walhamdulillahi wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillahi. ربنا علمنا ما ينفعنا وثبت أقدامنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الجاهلين. We wanted to begin after sending salawat on the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam on an important journey, the journey with knowledge and the journey with building the Muslim mind, and a reflective stop. And perhaps this is going to take a number of different lives in order to work through, but it's an important reflection. We have to realize that there are some deep issues that come along with knowledge after the fall of Al-Andalus specifically. One of the first things that we encounter in the clash between cultures, when the Spanish came into the Americas, they had a certain conception of knowledge. One of the first things that they impose is the primacy of writing to all other types of knowledge. The primacy of writing. And what that does is it eliminates any other sort of knowledge base from the equation. And this is one of the mistakes that was made when you talk about the history of America, or you talk about, or the Americas and the history of Africa, to devalue, for instance, petroglyphs, to devalue any sort of knowledge that's there, and to classify one type of knowledge better than another type of knowledge without due reason. This is the first issue, the issue of Eurocentricity, and the problem of how the domination of the European intellect brought in a certain way of thinking that eliminated other ways of thinking. Eurocentricity created a platform for us, not only which other types of knowledge that may have been known in the world were eliminated. I'll give you an example. Right now, one of the challenges that people are dealing with is scientism, meaning the primacy of the scientific methodology over everything else. That methodology of privileging certain things over other things is what led to a bad writing of the history of Africa for a long time. The way that European thinkers were talking about Africa was it didn't have any writings. It didn't have any history because it didn't have any writing. And then it was discovered that there was plenty of writing in Africa according to the criteria of the European community. And that was found in Timbuktu. One of the reasons why certain things took place in the Americas the way that they did was to be able to eliminate the indigenous from history. That was part of what was going on within knowledge in the European Western frame. It was to eliminate people from history. It was to justify the colonial project. And that doesn't need a Marxist to tell us that. That doesn't need a person on the left to tell us that. That's a reality that a lot of us have lived generation upon generation. To be eliminated from history, to be eliminated from the platform, to be eliminated from the legal system, to be eliminated from rights. Up to now, it still hasn't been totally corrected whether a person of African descent is a whole human being or 3.5. How do you deal with that? The indigenous people in the Americas, the claims to sovereignty. We still have situations in Puerto Rico and in other places where people don't have any sovereignty. They're indigenous in the land. When you talk about the problems of methodology, especially how some Muslims have engaged this issue, you talk about Muslims engaging these types of problems without having the proper methodological framework. Because some Muslims have adopted a certain way of thinking that it doesn't include the indigenous, it doesn't include the African. It doesn't include the struggles of the indigenous, the struggles of the Africans. It doesn't include the concept of justice overall. It includes a limited idea of justice. It includes a limited idea of the application of religiosity. And that's why we get to where we get to. If we were to go with the logic of some of the brothers that have attacked critical race theory, and to be honest with you, there's a lot of ways that we can deal with the problems of race and injustice. Those who have been in this for a long time, we don't depend solely on one school of thought. There's different methodological approaches that are taken. And that's the erroneous aspect that some brothers, they fall into. They try to categorize people. But if we were to use their logic, then they themselves would fall into a contradiction, because they're talking about not being able to benefit from different theories and different approaches to things. That would in itself collapse for them their own project in tradition that they claim to be a part of, for that camp that claims to be traditionalist. That means that their borrowing of the Greeks, their reformation of Greek thought, which, by the way, the Greeks were homosexuals, pedophilia was part of their practice as well. The gymnasium of Plato and Aristotle is historically known to have been a place of pedophilia. The philosophers were known as people that had espoused those types of concepts. Greek civilization was a civilization that was founded in the practice of homosexuality. These are facts that are known. But then you find Muslim thinkers come in and take that type of thinking, reform it, and use it to their benefit. That is a methodological contradiction that those that are just coming out to attack critical race theory, and this is not a defense of critical race theory. This is a defense of methodology. It's a defense of scholarship and the erroneous approach that people are taking. First of all, we will never accept the writing out of history or to decentralize African and indigenous people when it comes to how we're going to deal with issues in the Americas. We will never accept that it will only be a discussion solely on Muslim realities, and it won't be a discussion on the realities that affect human beings, especially when it affects these communities. Because that's not the way that the Islamic discourse operates. When we talk about prayer of the oppressed, just prayer of the oppressed by itself, we have a teaching in which Islam says that it does not matter who that person is that is oppressed, that when they call upon God, that their prayer is answered. And we will maintain that teaching as primacy, as having primacy when we start dealing with the issue of oppression. In other words, you can't block the means to a person that is oppressed from reaching the divine, from calling out to their assistance because of a criteria that you have. That's something that is the Creator has determined and made clear in teaching, that's something that will not happen. That is something that you as a believer, you can't block that person from reaching out in that way. And that prayer will be answered, the prayer of the oppressed. That's the first thing. So if we don't read in that type of spirit, and we don't think in that type of spirit and that on that level of justice, then we have an issue. The second issue is that the Prophet came rahmatan lil alameen. He came as a mercy for all of the creation. And in Islamic scholarship, they go into details about that. Some of them say all of the creation. So it includes everything that's created, the natural world. And that brings us very close to what indigenous communities with indigenous spiritualities that they're trying to say. And we, in that point, we align on that. Although we may differ on other issues, on that there's alignment. That there has to be ecological justice. There has to be justice for the natural environment, and so on and so forth. That the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in prophetic teaching, is teaching us about our relationship to the natural world. Wasn't there a prophetic teaching that talked about the mercy shown to a cat as being an entryway into the hereafter, into the higher levels of existence, into Jannah? Sure, we know that there's conditions, but we're talking about the spirit of what Islam is teaching, of how to deal with the creation, of the rights of the animal. As a matter of fact, Muslims wrote a whole book about the case of the animals against human beings. That's in tradition. That's in Islamic tradition. And so when we look at that reality, when we look at prophetic tradition, when we look at Islamic tradition, we see a sense of justice. We see a sense of learning how to borrow from ideas and take ideas. So the ideology or the ideological approach that some are taking, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense of that, how that approach is taken. Because what that does is that really is showing us that you, in this case in which is being brought up, you really don't care about indigenous and African lives in the America. You don't care about those lives. You don't care about Afro-indigenous lives or Afro-indigenous discourse. You don't care about the application of Islam to the reality of those peoples. As a matter of fact, the same school of thought has pushed to tell us that racism and systematic injustice and all of that doesn't even exist. And so that's where it becomes an issue that we forget about, the issue of scholarship. You just don't care about the conditions of the people. And you're telling the people that their suffering doesn't exist. You're telling the people that what they hold on to is just being brainwashed by leftist liberals. That's what we're being told, people. And so, okay, fine. If you want to eliminate critical race theory, and I made this already, since this is not just polemics. We're not just dealing with philosophy. We're dealing with real life situations and people's lives. That's why we have to have these discussions. Because it's not just a battle of ideas. If it was just a battle of ideas, then we can, it just remains a battle of ideas. It's your opinion, my opinion, we move on. But this impacts people's lives and how they think about themselves and how they act in the world. If you want to eliminate critical race theory, no problem. Then, okay, let's hear how you're going to deal with the issue of racism. Because it exists. Your denial of it existing means that you are not committing yourself to any type of justice. Tell the indigenous people on reservations, tell the people of Puerto Rico, tell the Lakota, the Sioux, the Cherokee, tell all of them that the genocide that took place, which we're still fighting to debate whether it exists or not. Tell them that the genocide is not real. Tell the people of the Middle Passage, all the African bodies that were dropped into the ocean, the biggest genocide that has existed between the African and the indigenous people on the face of this earth is the biggest genocide which has existed. Tell us that doesn't exist, that there was no injustice. Tell us it wasn't racist-based. Tell us that the debates that took place in the halls of theological debate whether the indigenous had a soul or not. The debates that took place legally, whether the Africans are a whole human being or not. Tell us that didn't exist. Tell us we're making that up. Tell us it was only the liberals that generated that discourse. If you can prove that reality to be the case, that is something of a figment of the imagination of the liberal, and it wasn't an issue in law, it wasn't an issue in theology, it wasn't an issue in academics, then we'll believe you. But the data is ushered against you. As a matter of fact, even women having a soul is a point of contention. Even women being the tools of the devil is a point of contention. All of this stuff is in the thinking, in Western thought. And it was a systematic thought that was there. So if you're telling us that doesn't exist, you know what I'm saying? There is a denial of history, is a denial of artifacts, is a denial of the way that things took place. It's like Columbus, you know what I'm saying, being accepted as a hero by the Italian community, but denying the fact that Columbus ushered in centuries of the shedding of blood. That's what we're before. Time to get off.
9:30.
Yeah. You give me sure. And so that's the reality at the end of the day. Also fundamentally wrong here. When we look at the tradition of Al-Andalus or the tradition of Iraq as being centers of learning, or the tradition of Timbuktu as being a center of learning, it was not only focused on spirituality, people. It was not only focused on Aqidah, people. They dealt with architecture. They dealt with mathematics. They dealt with psychology. They dealt with chemistry. They dealt with history. They dealt with sociology. They dealt with multiple sciences. Unfortunately, the Muslim community went into a decline intellectually and academically and has not developed on those fronts. So these discussions about how institutions work and how society functions and so on and so forth. Of course, many of the Muslims don't have the tools to deal with it because they haven't expanded themselves beyond talking about a limited sense of religion. And that's something that you have to acknowledge at the end of the day, that the curriculum that many Muslims that are operating out of is very limited. Their knowledge base is very limited. But Islamic sciences, the Islamic base is very wide because it includes talking about other things in life. Islamic tradition is not just a discourse on spirituality. It's not just a discourse on basics of belief. As a matter of fact, part of the problem that we have here is for those who claim that they follow Islamic tradition, and in specific, they claim to follow Ashari Aqidah, so to speak, is that when you go to, for instance, the Muwaqif of Imam al-Iji, they're talking about physics and they're talking about things that don't necessarily apply to Aqidah directly. As a matter of fact, they're bringing in different sciences to talk about their beliefs. And so, for instance, these discussions on how these concepts work, you know what I'm saying, of race in this society is only legitimate that there's going to be a discourse that's going to talk about how race is dealt with in law, how race is dealt with in medicine, how race is dealt with in history, because that's a concept that was engineered in Eurocentric thinking. The primacy of race in everything. That's just the reality. Eurocentric thought, that's how it dealt with the world. How they did geography. Europe is at the center of the world. Even in the American concept of how you do history and how you do geography, America is at the center of the world. The U.S. is considered America even. They don't even consider America as a whole. Canada, the Caribbean, North America, South America. Even the word America is an imposition of European understanding of these geographical regions. It's not how the indigenous people understand these concepts. If we were to go into the concept of Turtle Island, or we were to go into the concept of Borinquen, or we were to go into the concept of the Caribbean, more indigenous terms, like what was the application geographically, or even how the geography was thought about. So we have to understand that there is a certain way of thinking that is race-based and ethnocentric that has been imposed. So then there's a counter to that, which says, no, we have to detangle. We can't just, knowledge is not just thinking in that way. Knowledge is not just what the Europeans say, or those who have given primacy to whiteness, which this is where we start getting to white supremacy as being a child of Eurocentricity. Really, the problem in knowledge is Eurocentricity, and white supremacy becomes the ideology which supports all of that. So that racism becomes, the privileging of one race over others. And in this case, when we start talking about racism in the American context, is privileging the white race above others. There's a lot of things that are missing in the way that this community discusses issues. First of all, there's a civilizational decline, which means that you're deficient in talking in psychology. You're deficient in talking in sociology. You're deficient in talking in political science. You're deficient in talking about history, anthropology. Walaikum salam. What time do you get out?
9:30.
And medicine and so on and so forth. And that's just the reality at the end of the day. The Muslims declined, and they didn't develop in these sciences. And so now we have people that want to talk like they're experts in these sciences, and they're not. They're not experts in Islamic tradition. And that's the reality. And those even who have studied Islamic tradition, when it comes to the methodological approach, we question where you stand in Islamic tradition, because you become a person that is contradicting certain points. Let's deal with methodological issues. Your methodology is not civilizational. And that's why you're not approaching civilizational issues. That's why you're not approaching societal issues. And you're talking about how Islam deals with these things, but you collapse yourself. Again, if we're going to take that approach, of deconstruction at that point, which is if we want to be philosophical about it, let's say you're taking a postmodern approach. If you're going to deconstruct critical race theory, then you're going to fall into the point of having to deconstruct ilm al-kalam, which you claim you follow. And some people are pro doing that. Again, you're going to follow into, if you're going to say that all because it's an idea that comes from the left, you're going to fall into a problem, because Islamic scholarship has never had a problem with borrowing ideas and integrating them. Internally, the debate has always been to what extreme that has been, and that's part of the debate between the Athari approach and the school of ilm al-kalam. To what extent are things being taken? But it's never been in the Ummah that is not, borrowing ideas is a problem. So I think if we want to come to a more scholarly approach and we want to criticize critical race theory, we should talk about methodological excesses. I'm all for criticizing critical race theory. I'm not for just saying that we just throw it all out because it doesn't fit our scheme. That doesn't work like that. The people who have criticized critical race theory, whether it's Daniel Hakikaju, whether it's Abdullah al-Andalusi, whether it's Dr. Abdullah Hamid Ali, they have not brought us an appropriate way of dealing with knowledge methodologically. They have not brought us a way of dealing with the problems of race in Western society. They have called us to a denial of white supremacy. They have fixated us on liberalism mostly. And really what they're talking about is not even liberalism. What they're talking about is libertinism. You know what I'm saying? Because they have not, if they're going to criticize liberalism, then they need to go into liberalism as well. And we need to hear a critique of the economic system of capitalism. And we need to hear a critique of individualism. So we're not getting real scholarship here. We're getting some sense of being critical. That's good. We're getting a sense of we have to watch out for these different ideas that are out there in schools of thought. That's a start. They started us on some critical thought of not just accepting ideas. That's fine. But they are not teaching us how to deal with the ideas. So they help us as the demolition crew, but they don't help us in building. And then the demolition is not across the board. It's chosen, it's selected. They don't help us in demolishing racism and injustice and oppression. They don't help us in an analysis of all of these issues. They only talk to us about spirituality and being conservative and preserving some values of the deen. But at the individual level, they don't help us at how do you do that at the group level. They claim that they help us at the group level. And personally, I don't have any issue with them personally at all. May Allah bless them and guide them for whatever good and their intentions. The issue that I have is when we become ideological. And it forces us into a position where we have to have discussions which become ideological. I'm not interested in ideological discussions. I'm not interested in wasting my time like that. I want to hear how we're going to deal with things methodologically speaking, not ideologically speaking. Because methodologically, there's some erroneous positions that have been taken that are going to undermine you yourself. And this is, a principle of charity, of saying like, look, brothers, like, slow down. You took this to such an extent that, you no longer are defending the dignity of women. You no longer are defending the dignity of people of different ethnic groups. You no longer are championing the issue of justice, because you have gone so far to attack the issue of liberalism, and you haven't really attacked liberalism. You're just attacking popular culture. That you have called into question the project that you had. So if you want to save the project that you have, you need to start talking about methodological issues and where it is things can be corrected, and you have to bring in a sense of intellectual equity. Or else, the whole concept of saving the family, the whole concept of healthy sexuality, the whole concept of fairness to all people, that's what you're arguing for, right? All of that goes out the door. All of that goes out the door. And then what happens is that now you call into question Islam, because it looks more that you're more pushing a conservative white philosophy versus Islamic values and ethics in the name of trying to, support the deen. Again, when you start denying that racism exists and systemic racism exists, that's a direct attack on African and indigenous peoples, because you're now negating the history of suffering. And they're not whiners, because they're people of resistance. They don't play the victim role like you claim, because they're the ones that have brought to the Muslim community their rights of standing. They're the ones that have brought to the Muslim community a sense of justice, whether it's Malcolm X or whether it's Frantz Fanon, or whether it's, a lot of the liberation struggles. We can go on and we can continue to name, even if you don't include, certain things in a certain frame, others do include it. And I'm not going to go into more detail than that so that it doesn't turn into a polemical argument. But methodologically speaking, we're off. Tradition is not just only talking about spirituality. Tradition includes different sciences that are transmitted, that deal with revelation, and sciences which are rational, which deal with understanding the world. And so you can't say that we're only talking about deen without an understanding of the world. The Prophet ﷺ gave us foundational principles of dealing with racism. We know that tribalism existed, but we know also that Islamic teaching didn't go to the details of understanding how it is that this stuff manifests itself in terms of institutions and so on and so forth. These are modern contemporary concepts which didn't exist in the past. So you're not just going to be able to go to the tradition and just bring out a detailed answer, or to the Quran and Sunnah and bring out a detailed answer. You require ijtihad to talk about how these things manifest themselves in the world. If you eliminate borrowing ideas from others because of who they are, then you undermine your own tradition, because your own tradition of ilm al-kalam, that's exactly what they did. They borrowed from homosexuals. They borrowed from people that were known to engage in pedophilia, and they transformed their ideas. That's a fact. That's a fact. That's the extent of the problem that you have raised for yourself. The Greeks were not the best people in character to borrow from. They were some of the most racist, ethnocentric people on the face of the earth. And you have a whole tradition that based its defense of Islamic Aqidah in that Ilm al-Kalam school of thought that borrowed from that camp. We'll wait to hear a response of how you're going to work through those methodological issues. We prefer that you do it systematically, right? But if not, we say that, this is more ideological than it is concerned with issues of scholarship and the well-being of the community, at the end of the day. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.